Hello and welcome to the Nirvana Principle Show. My name is Dr. Hassan Mallick. Welcome to season 2 of our show. Some updates for the listeners. I've been up to some interesting things in the time I've been away. I've moved to London and now I'm called a specialty registrar. I'm a higher trainee, so career advancement for me. Also, the show has grown. I'm so pleased with the number of listeners we have and the feedback we've gotten for our last season. So thank you for your recommendations for new shows as well. We'll try and catch as many of them as we can. We're also on YouTube and TikTok. So I've heard that nowadays TikTok is the way to go. A lot of my friends nowadays come to me and tell me about how they've diagnosed themselves with one condition or the other after seeing something on YouTube or TikTok. So I thought, I'm a psychiatrist. I could maybe talk about some of that stuff. So feel free to check it out. Tell me what you think. We're also coming off some collective conscience sessions, which were music only. And I'm pleased to share that our episode on video games was number 1 on the Mixcloud charts. So please do check that out as well and let me know what you think. Since I've moved here to London, I've met some interesting doctors, and one of the feedback for a new show was on ADHD, which is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today, who's going to be talking about ADHD. She's an advocate for doctors. She works with the British Medical Association, is involved with them. And I feel advocacy is a strong part of her life because she also works with forensic psychiatry and with court services and the interface between mental health as well as the law. Finally, she also has a personal experience with ADHD. She has a bit of insight which you might not get from a regular, psychiatrist. I think nowadays lived experience is very important to us. Just to understand that beyond just checklists and scales and medication, there is a person behind a label. So our guest for today is Dr. Mavi Capanna. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
So tell me what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so I think we're going to cover quite a lot of stuff around the topic of ADHD. So I think we'll start off talking about ADHD and what it is, get some of that stuff out of the way that isn't the meat of what we're going to talk about, and then move on to some of the more juicy aspects around what the impacts of ADHD can be, its interplay with social structures and substance misuse, and then dispelling some of the conversations that have been had over the last few years with high IQ and ADHD and the interplay between that.
The part of this show is also we're not just a couple of doctors sitting here telling you, or just teaching you about ADHD. There are new frontiers in this conversation, and there are elements which maybe have a lot of media coverage these days. For example, hyperfocus is one of them, or how people who are super intelligent are still experiencing the symptoms of ADHD. So welcome back. You're listening to the Nirvana Principle Show. I have here with me Dr. Mavi Capanna, who's a fellow psychiatrist, and she's going to be talking about ADHD. Mavi, there's been a lot of conversation around ADHD. Can you tell me what it is from a specialist point of view? How do you define it?
Sure. So ADHD, so Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, it's a condition that affects behavior and cognitive function. So that's the functioning of your brain and kind of how we relate to one another and how we process information and learn. And usually, so it's diagnosed in children. That's where we see it the most in the diagnosis. It's diagnosed kind of not by your GP, but it has to be referred to a specialist service. And you have to have had the symptoms kind of most days, every day for about 6 months, and have to have had it start before the age of 12. And the really key thing with ADHD is it has to be across settings. So, for example, in home and at school, or when they're going on play dates with other children, it has to be consistently across settings. And that's done so that it's not just they're being bullied at school and that's why they're behaving that way, or they're having issues at home. Maybe there's some kind of parental disagreements leading to that behavior in just one setting. So that's a key element of ADHD diagnosis. And the other aspect is that it has to be affecting the lives of the individual affected considerably, both kind of socially, academically, or as adults at an occupational level. And the symptoms can't just be explained by some sort of developmental delay or disorder or some other mental illness.
What do you mean by developmental?
So, for example, someone who also has autism, are these symptoms because that they have kind of a delay in their functioning or a delay in their development? Can it be explained by some other disorder? That has to be ruled out as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned autism, and I think I did feel some similarities that even in autism, some symptoms or some features have to be present before a certain age most times, and it's common sense, I guess. You don't need a doctor to tell you that when you're growing up, that's when your brain and your mind, your body is forming. So just like any other experience, it affects how you act or react in the future.
Yeah, and I think there are, as you say, specific things that people look out for. So there, and it's good to kind of dispel quickly the idea that you only have to be a super hyperactive child or person in order to have a diagnosis of ADHD. There's different subsets, and one of them is the hyperactivity and the impulsive element. So that's, someone who's not really able to sit still, fidgeting, not able to concentrate. You're seeing the children in school putting their hands up very quickly before the teacher's even finished kind of asking the question. They're always talking. They're kind of over-inclusive in their conversation. They're switching from topic to topic, and interrupting a lot. And there's this impulsivity element to the hyperactivity that is going to come up later in our conversation, where there's very limited sense of danger. So you see children or, just saying, right, I'm just going to cross the road. I'm going to cross the road and this is when I'm going to do it. And they kind of ignore the other elements that might be dangerous. And in adults, we'll touch upon this later on. There's kind of that impulsivity towards risk taking, both in personal decisions, such as getting into relationships or how they interact with others, but also in personal ones, such as getting a mortgage or using drugs. So that's kind of usually what we think of when we think of ADHD, but there's a whole other subset, which is the inattentiveness element, where it's just, making these careless mistakes, not really paying attention, very easily distracted, kind of moving from task to task, especially when the tasks are pretty tedious and they're not interested in them. And again, we'll touch on this when we discuss hyperfocus, which is a kind of relatively new area that's come about in the sphere of ADHD.
Very interesting. I mean, you were talking about how it affects a person, I guess, in terms of what you see, but what is the internal milieu like? What is the internal experience of ADHD? Do you feel like you have ADHD or something's wrong? Or are you like, I'm myself? And what are these people? Why is everyone looking at me weird?
Yeah, I guess that's a really interesting question. I guess it's a range, like everything. It's a spectrum. But when I was in a clinic, kind of seeing a lot of children with ADHD, children kind of know that something isn't quite right because they're getting into trouble. They're kind of socially isolated by their peers. They're not popular with their peers. They're kind of lagging behind in school. It's really common for these children to also have kind of language and motor development delay. And they're kind of having these secondary impacts to their ADHD that then lead to low self-esteem. So they'll come in and it's not unusual for them to say, I feel really unpopular in school. I'm isolated. I feel down. I feel anxious. I don't have much self-esteem and kind of what I want to do in the future. And that's really common to see. So there is that element. And I guess in adults, maybe less so, because as you say, people are just like, well, this is who I am. This is how I've been my whole life.
I alluded to it in while introducing you, but you also have a close member of your family, or you have lived with someone with ADHD. Can you tell me what your experience has been like?
Yeah, so I think so. Obviously, my family member was diagnosed later in life when he was an adult, and I think it was more like you were saying that it, he never even thought that he might have ADHD because it was just not something that was picked up when he was a child, and then obviously knowing a psychiatrist, I was like, well, actually, a lot of these symptoms coincide and they've been there for quite some time. And I think it can be really difficult sometimes to live around someone that has ADHD because, you know, you're making lists, you're trying to support them and kind of sticking to a task, being somewhere on time. And if you don't know that they're struggling with it because of ADHD, it can come across, you know, sometimes like a laziness or unwillingness to help, which can then kind of lead to issues within interpersonal relationships, which is one of the topics that I think we're going to talk about.
You talked about like ADHD. Fine, so we understand what kind of symptoms there are, what's the experience like looking from the outside and maybe looking from the inside. What's treatment? Can be treated? Is there a way to I feel like in psychiatry we have one of two things that we can do. Either we talk about cure, but it's more called remission, as in how long you can be free of symptoms, free of the features of a certain condition. I don't want to see it as, I want to call it a disease, because it's more like a dysfunction, it's more a disorder. That's that it makes it difficult for you to live your life. So what can we do to help? And do people who have ADHD, do they feel they need help?
Yeah, I mean, so the medication is the first line used, and you know, ADHD medication is a stimulant medication. So the most common one is methylphenidate, which is stimulant medication.
Ritalin.
Yes, Ritalin, especially popular.
In med students.
Yes, and in American universities, it's a favorite drug. But it's quite counterintuitive because I remember explaining it to families in clinic and being like, well, you know, this person they're super hyperactive. They can't sit still. I'm going to give them a stimulant medication. And you have these mothers and fathers kind of looking at each other like, oh my God, that makes absolutely no sense. Like, this doctor has gone absolutely crazy. But so it's completely counterintuitive. But how it works is that there's kind of parts of the brain that are involved in concentration, attention, hyperactivity, that have a deficiency in some of the hormones and chemicals that make the brain work the way it does. And the role of some of those hormones and chemicals and neurotransmitters, as we call them, especially dopamine, is that it has kind of an inhibitory function as well as a stimulating function.
Yeah.
And if the dopamine levels are low in certain parts of the brain, then actually that inhibition is gone. And so that's why you get the symptoms of they're too hyper, they're too impulsive, because they don't have that chemical stopping it and dampening it down when it's meant to. So by actually increasing the production of that stimulating neurochemical, you're actually then increasing their ability to focus and pay attention and be less impulsive.
Yeah, like increasing power to the off button. It's like, but you're increasing the power. It's like, no, but it'll increase it to stop something rather than to start something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you. So methylphenidate, that's one of the ways to treat someone. And like you said, it's a stimulant. I know I did a rotation. So we have like 6 months in a learning disability and child psychiatry post. And I was like, wow, ADHD, just 4 drugs. That's it. That's all we need to, that's all we prescribe. So usually for psychiatrists, drugs are the way to go. It's usually a bunch that you need to know. But But do you think it's just that, just four drugs or just stimulant drugs? That's it that we can use?
Yeah, I mean, I'm never one to say, it's just this. I think that's naive. But the drugs in ADHD are super effective. They're about 80% effective, so they're good drugs. But at the same time, there's a lot of work to do around the medication. Adherence. So how often somebody is taking the medication as they're meant to is still quite low, and that's because there's side effects. There's the social stigma of someone being on medication. If you think of a teenager telling their friends that they're taking a stimulant, might not be something, might make them really popular because they think, oh, God, you have the good pills, let's share them around. But at the same time, it might make them seem like they're damaged, they need medication, and it might or isolate someone who already feels isolated even more. So there's a lot of work that goes around kind of family therapy, family support, like the education around why you have to take the medication, why it's helpful, and also looking at kind of ways to teach the person, try and do short stints of concentrating, take a break, shift your focus, and ways to work with their kind of ADHD diagnosis rather than against it. And also identifying if there's any other comorbid disorders. So like we say, is there anxiety? Is there depression? Is there substance use? And kind of working with those as well. So it's more a whole rounded approach with the medication being a key bit.
I'm Hassan Mallick, and we're talking about ADHD today with Dr. Mavi Capanna. We've talked a little bit about what ADHD is, what kind of symptoms there are, and how it affects individuals both internally and externally, especially children growing up. I'm curious, Mavi, that it makes sense that if you're like a child who has inattentive features, then you won't do great at school. But we have medication and we can treat most of it. What happens as the kids grow older? Does it go away? Does it still stay? Does it rear its head in new forms?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, and there's loads of facets to it. So, I mean, I guess it's a really big topic. So I guess we could try and split it up a bit to answer your first question. Does it actually go away? I mean, most things, it's very hard to think of something that just disappears, but obviously if people kind of put effort in and work with the teams and with themselves and take the medication, you can reduce a lot of the symptoms. With age as well, there's good studies out there that show that the symptoms of ADHD do get better with age, but you always have to have that scientific approach in thinking, is it just that it's age, or are there other confounding factors? So for example, are people just learning how to live with ADHD and learning what works for them? Is it that the medication is helping? Is it that they stop asking for help and so we just know about it less? Or is there that they're doing other things that are not as helpful, but that are compensating for some of their symptoms? So, for example, I think later we're going to talk about substance use in ADHD. And I think that's one element of it, about the age and the progression. But I think we already touched on some of the other things that happen with ADHD. And, we spoke about how in children there's social isolation and interpersonal difficulties that develop. And that's a really interesting aspect of the long-term consequences of ADHD. So I think that might be a good thing to focus in on.
Yeah. So, I mean, as a kid, you mentioned, for example, someone's impulsive, and when they're waiting to cross a road, they might, for example, just run into the road, not thinking about looking right or left. Or, again, the example of school and being inattentive there. But then how do these core features, how do they translate into adulthood? What new forms will it take?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of people, the issues are when we don't diagnose ADHD, or when someone doesn't know that they have ADHD. And so they have that lack of insight into why they are how they are. And there's two aspects of this. So, for example, if you have an adult, like I mentioned before, that doesn't know they have ADHD and they still have that impulsive nature, that kind of lack of attention to detail and taking risks, it can become, for example, you're buying a house and it says, you can wait 3 months and do a survey and check all the boxes. Someone with ADHD that's not diagnosed might just be like, well, never mind, I'll just crack on with it. And then they take a future risk, but in the immediate moment, they're being quite impulsive. Same with kind of in their jobs, they might take higher risk jobs. They might be kind of more difficult to work with because they're switching from topic to topic, and they're not completing tasks. So that's one of the ways. But I think the part that makes me more fascinated with what happens to children with ADHD, whether they know or they don't know about it, is that element that we were talking about, those interpersonal difficulties, that emotional regulation, and what does that do to them long term. So, for example, if you have a child that has ADHD, and they are having issues in school, they're having issues at home, that might really impact their attachment with their caregivers and with their siblings and with their friends. So they might struggle to form a functional attachment with their primary caregiver. There might be tensions. The mother or the father might become more resentful towards that child. And then that leads to kind of an emotional impact on that child that they might carry for the rest of their life. So that lack of strong, safe attachment, because of some of the behaviors that they're exhibiting when they're children with ADHD, then become a pattern of how they relate to other adults or in their relationships in the future. So that's something that then fuels kind of further social isolation, further difficulty in establishing relationships. They can develop deep anxiety, depression. We see children that develop kind of conduct disorder-like behaviors. So kind of getting kicked out of school, not having a safe peer group to test their boundaries with. And all of these things, even outside the sphere of having ADHD, we know that children that have these difficulties then carry them into how their personality is formed and how they relate to other people in their adult life.
I mean, just hearing you talk, like I was picturing someone like a parent telling a child that, you never listen, or what I've told you like 100 times to do it this way, or to do this task. I don't know, maybe clean your bed. That person, that individual, that child, they have ADHD, and it's much more difficult to do those repetitive, maybe even boring tasks. I can picture that relationship fracturing because of it, that, okay, why don't they listen? Are they rude? Am I a bad parent? And then what exactly happens? Or if someone does have ADHD, what kind of emotional impact does it have? How are their relationships like? Let's say, for example, romantic relationships.
Yeah, so I guess, for example, if you have someone that's married to someone that has ADHD, whether they know or they don't know, that partner might feel strained, that they have to be the one organizing things. They have to look after the home. They have to remind their partner constantly to do little tasks that you would expect to have support with. They might forget appointments. They might need help with their medical care. They'll forget that they've booked on to do, a special date night, and so they don't show up, or they forget a work meeting, and then they bring all that stress into the relationship. And I guess you need to have quite an understanding partner to accommodate that. And actually, it's quite interesting, because I saw someone in an adult ADHD clinic, and they were referred to their GP and then to tertiary services because their wife had passed away, and they suddenly were, not paying bills, not paying their mortgage, not attending appointments. And it all came to light that actually his wife was doing all of those things and compensating for the ADHD. And it was only when the partner wasn't around anymore that it came to light that they had serious issues with organization and function. and the social functioning just completely deteriorated. So I think it has quite a strain on the partner, and I guess that's one aspect that people do have to learn to deal with.
You did mention some misdiagnosis as well. So, for example, substance misuse. When you say substance misuse, just basically talking about taking recreational drugs. Why is that an appealing option for someone with ADHD?
Yeah, so I think that's two things that we can discuss. So one is, the misdiagnosis, and it's not just substance use, but we'll talk about substance use. But there's, there's this diagnostic overshadowing sometimes with people that present with these interpersonal difficulties. So a lot of the stuff we've talked about could come up in someone who has, for example, a personality disorder, or they have a comorbid anxiety and depression disorder because of the difficulties they have. But people and professionals focus in on the current presentation, so the personality traits, the anxiety traits, the depression traits, the fact that they're not functioning well in society, and they forget to look at the root cause, which in some cases is actually the ADHD. And I've had one patient when I was working in with children and adolescent services, where there was a girl that just kept being referred round and round again, and everyone was saying, this is an emerging personality disorder, that this is just her personality, it's nothing to do with her neurodevelopment. But actually, it was ADHD, and it was how she learned to interact with people and those social difficulties that had then precipitated this presentation of a personality disorder. So I think it's really important that as professionals, we keep that at the back of our head, like, is there a neurodevelopmental problem that has led to this endpoint?
We're reaching towards the end of our segment time. Do you want to answer the second part of my question, which was around this relationship with substance misuse?
Yeah, so I guess it's very common to have people self-medicating with substances, especially stimulants. And I think we touched earlier on how the medication works for ADHD and how the ADHD brain works. And so I think it's quite a logical conclusion why someone might find that, when I take stimulants, actually, I think clearer. I'm able to slow down and think about things. And, you find people that say, well, I take these stimulants and I don't necessarily just take them for the high. I take them for the clarity and peace of thought. And so it makes a lot of sense why they would use kind of the same as what we'd give them in medication form to process their experiences more. And I guess that's one side of it. The other side of it is you have highly impulsive individuals. And we know that when people are impulsive, they will take more risk, and drug taking is a risky behavior. So I think it's both of those elements that create this perfect storm in ADHD, where it's more probable that there is substance misuse and addiction.
The way I see it is more a bit about, I feel novelty seeking is a aspect of it. Like, drugs can be an easy answer when you're just looking, you're like, okay, I've done this before, it's boring. There's something new in it, there's something fresh in it. And it would, apart from the self-medication that you said, it also seems like something which would seem entertaining to someone with ADHD. Do you think that's fair to say?
And I think, in my view, it'd be more around the impulsivity and the risk taking, because you could apply what you've just said to anyone, the novelty seeking, the boredom aspect. But I think what's more appealing to me as an explanation in a person with ADHD is that lack of impulse control and that lack of consequence thinking and the risk-taking behavior.
Is it stimulants in particular? When we're saying stimulants, I assume we're talking about things like methamphetamine, cocaine, even just like abusing these prescription drugs off prescription. Are these the ones in particular that you see more?
I think if you're trying to answer the aspect that are they self-medicating, yes. If you're thinking about the impulsivity element, it can branch out to any kind of drug of abuse or taking more of your prescribed medication. Hi, welcome back, and we're going to take off where we left off, talking about ADHD and its relation to hyperfocus and high IQ.
What is hyperfocus? Sounds like a superpower.
It does. It's a very cool word. I enjoy it loads. So hyperfocus, and especially in ADHD, is a phenomenon that happens when people lock in into a certain task or topic. So people with ADHD, as we know from our conversation already, have a difficulty in kind of staying on one task, and they shift from task to task and they kind of lose focus. But when there's a topic, especially focusing for them, that they find really interesting, and they find that it's kind of their niche, they're able to really, really focus on this. And that's what hyperfocus is. So you could spend hours just focusing in on their subject of choice. And it's a phenomenon we see in people with ADHD. And I just think that's incredibly interesting, especially because it's been in the news and the media surrounding kind of high profile people that have ADHD and their ability to be incredibly successful because of the hyperfocus element.
When you say hyperfocus, do you mean like I'm picturing someone literally reading a book or like researching deep into a topic, or is it like task oriented? Like, I don't know, for example, let's say DJing, you can DJ for like 4 hours in a flow state. Is it like that?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, I guess my kind of family member that had ADHD, is like you could spend maybe 8 hours just looking up kind of engineering topics and just spend, it's like you don't know that it's 2 a.m. They're still there. They're down a rabbit hole on Wikipedia, on YouTube, and they're just so interested in the topic, and they're so interested in the task at hand that everything else kind of falls apart. Like everything else doesn't matter. You don't drink, you don't eat, you don't interact with anyone. You're just focused on the topic you're looking into. And I guess it's very something you wouldn't expect from someone with ADHD, because you're expecting them to jump from topic to topic, and that is the standard operating procedure. But you can get this phenomenon, and it's what makes some people who have ADHD incredibly successful in their fields.
So would it be fair to say that it's not the attending to a topic, it's switching between topics that's a difficulty?
I mean, it can be both. I mean, if you have the typical diagnostic criteria for a child with ADHD would be that they are switching between topic to topic and they're jumping from conversation subject to conversation subject. So this is kind of a parallel phenomenon to that diagnostic criteria that you see not in all, but in some people with ADHD.
And is there a relation to intelligence with that?
There's been conflicting literature over the years. Some people say, obviously you see this with people that have ADHD and they're extremely successful. They're, very high up in their fields. Is it because people with ADHD end up having higher IQ, or is there some sort of interplay between that? And that could be the case, but also high IQ and high intelligence does mimic ADHD in some of its aspects. So, individuals with high intelligence do show more hyperactivity, and they have attention difficulties because they're so interested in so many topics and they're able to hold all those thoughts at once. They have kind of problems following rules and kind of sticking with a task. In school, they tend to get bored because maybe they understand the concept very quickly, and then they get bored with the lesson, and so they're doing other things. They're looking around, they're moving from task to task, and so they can appear like they have symptoms of ADHD, but actually it's the high intelligent aspect. And I think that also translates in, we do see studies that show that people with higher intelligence have social difficulties. So it also touches on our previous topic around the social difficulties in ADHD. And so there's so many parallels that sometimes they resemble each other.
I was reading this book by Cal Newport. It's called Deep Work. This gentleman was like echoing the same thing that you said, that most people who have done something substantial, whether it's written a book, whether you think about, I don't know, Carl Jung, whether you think about Steve Jobs, they have huge swaths of their life which is just dedicated to like one topic for hours at a time for days on end. And pretty much what I guess the quintessential, savant picture is just someone who just is in their books, doesn't eat, doesn't drink. There's that professor who puts, the smoking pipe in their jacket and they have holes from it. And so yes, it definitely sounds like a familiar narrative.
And there's a lot of other things that could play into that, but I think this is a really interesting part of the research that's gone on around ADHD that's useful to bring up, just to get people thinking about. There's so many aspects. There's just a milieu of things that come in under the umbrella of ADHD research and where it's going in the future.
Do we know exactly the pathways or the features internally, like in the brain, what causes hyperfocus? Do you have any explanations for it?
Not that I'm aware of, and I'm that there's been research gone into this. I think it's all like with everything in mental health. It's all about kind of hypothesis testing and looking into why things happen. But there's so many neurotransmitters in the brain, and there's so many confounding factors that I think I would struggle to be like, this is the one cause, and truly stand behind that.
Yeah, I mean, even things like depression, which we've been treating, and there's this whole conversation around serotonin, low mood. Now we're like, but is it?
Exactly.
That's a theory, but do we know? So I share your I share that ideal that okay, yeah, we could say why it works, but then we're not gonna be 100% sure either way, and it's always like healthy to challenge belief sets that we already have. I think that's kind of what makes psychiatry a bit interesting and exciting as well.
Yeah, well, it's what makes humans as complicated as we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so I feel like we're pretty much towards the end of our time together. Mavi, thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us. I've had a lot of fun.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great.
So I do know that you're super busy all the time. But if anyone wants to reach out to you, is there any way? Most guests here, they leave like a Twitter handle.
Yeah, so I mean, my Twitter's fine. It's just at MV and then my surname Capanna. If you have any questions or want to reach out, happy to be contacted.
So that's about it for us for ADHD. This is quite a vast topic and we discussed quite a few things, but do know that this is a general discussion and shouldn't be taken as medical advice. You can reach out to your friendly neighborhood psychiatrist or GP if you feel this is something that you want to know more about. You can find some links to websites which can help you in the show description. So we'll see each other again next month and stay tuned.